What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 12. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS main slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Oh, and good news, guys. Make sure to stay tuned to the very end of this video because we removed the box that was popping up and blocking the lineup. So now you can see a full lineup using these picks that we made in this video if you stay to the very end. Okay, guys, NFL Week 12. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. So the stud on the slate, I like Tom Brady. He's got a great matchup here versus the Indianapolis Colts. He's going to be playing in a high-scoring game. Vegas thinks there's going to be 53 points scored in this game, with the Tampa Bay Bucks favored by 3. The Colts give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Tom Brady is 7,600 DraftKings salary. He's 600 more on FanDuel. Projected at 24.4 fantasy points here in Week 12. He's going to be about 9% owned, and he scored 23, 15, and 31 fantasy points in the last 3 games, averaging 25.9 fantasy points per game on the season. So I like Tom Brady. He's a great play this week. He's the most expensive quarterback on the slate, but he's got some monster upside. So I like Tom Brady here versus the Indianapolis Colts. Okay, now coming down off of Tom Brady, I think Jalen Hurts is in a pretty good spot here, but at 7,300 DraftKings salary, I think I'd just rather pay the 300 more for Tom Brady. So I might pass on Jalen Hurts, and he's super expensive on FanDuel. He's 1,100 more on FanDuel, so he's more expensive than Tom Brady on FanDuel. So if I'm gonna save some salary, and if I want to go out there and get a stud on the slate, take a look at Justin Herbert from the LA Chargers playing the Denver Broncos, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing quarterbacks, but Justin Herbert has averaged 25 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.9 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 10% owned, projected at 21.3 fantasy points here in Week 12. He's 6,600 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Chargers favored by 2.5. So not a great matchup here, but a pretty high-scoring game and a close, competitive game. And you're getting a pretty big discount, saving $1,000 coming down to Justin Herbert from Tom Brady. And Justin Herbert has scored 38, 13, and 35 fantasy points in the last 3 games. You can make a case that Justin Herbert has a bigger ceiling than Tom Brady does. He got 9 rush attempts last game, so you get that nice rushing floor with Justin Herbert. So I like the salary savings, especially on DraftKings. So I like Justin Herbert here versus the Denver Broncos. Okay, now here's a low-owned quarterback that I think's in a good spot this week. His salary's pretty low here, although it's only 300 less than Justin Herbert, but the ownership is way lower. So for a tournament play, I like Kirk Cousins from the Minnesota Vikings playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Kirk Cousins has averaged 21.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 1.8 rush attempts per game. Now, he's only going to be about 2% owned, projected at 18.8 fantasy points here in Week 12. He's 6,300 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Vikings trailing by 3. So Kirk Cousins has played really well so far this season. He's been pretty consistent throughout, and he scored 28, 19, and 22 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So you got a pretty good quarterback matchup here, relatively high scoring game, a passing game script, and low ownership at only 2%, which makes him a pretty awesome tournament play. So I like Kirk Cousins here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Now, if you want to save a bunch of salary at the quarterback position, take a look at Jimmy Garoppolo from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jimmy Garoppolo has averaged 17.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 5% owned, projected at 17.1 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $5,700 DraftKings salary, $800 more on FanDuel. So I like that price on both sites. And we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 3. So Jimmy Garoppolo, he hasn't had the best season so far, but he does have some great pass catchers. He's got the offensive weapons, and he's in a great matchup, a fantastic matchup here versus the Minnesota Vikings. So I think this could be a Jimmy Garoppolo type game where he can put up 20 plus fantasy points. So I like Jimmy Garoppolo here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Oh, another thing to note about this pick is that their running back position has been decimated. They are down to their 3rd string running back. So that could play into some extra passes or, a tendency to pass the ball in this good matchup. So I really do think it could be a great ceiling game for Jimmy Garoppolo here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, everyone, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway. And the winner is Katie's Corner. Katie's Corner, congratulations. You are the winner of this week's $25 PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So you got Jonathan Taylor, who's just been an absolute stud, but he doesn't have the best matchup, although it didn't stop him last week. He scored 56 fantasy points off of 32 rush attempts and 3 pass targets, but I am just a little bit concerned about the 32 rush attempts that he got last week. And are they going to give Jonathan Taylor a break, not wanting this guy to burn himself out here? It's just, for me, it's hard to play a guy after he puts up 56 fantasy points. Normally, 8 times out of 10, the next game is a letdown game, and you're going to have to pay $9,100 DraftKings salary and $700 more on FanDuel, and he's going to be about 13% owned, so I'm not counting him out totally. Probably going to have a lineup with him just in case, but he's not going to be one of the guys that I play in a bunch of my lineups. The guy that I'm looking at, the stud on the slate that I would prefer to play, is Christian McCaffrey from the Carolina Panthers playing the Miami Dolphins, who have the 3rd worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs, and Christian McCaffrey has averaged 20.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.8 rush attempts per game and 6.7 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 86% of the snaps, touches the ball 51% of that time. He's going to be about 18% owned, projected at 23.2 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 9,000 DraftKings salary, 700 more on FanDuel. And Christian McCaffrey has scored 25 and 26 fantasy points in his last two games off of 10 and 13 rush attempts on top of 8 and 10 pass targets. So you're getting a running back and a wide receiver in one player, one of the best in the business. And his salary has been inching up ever since he came back from injury. He's been a great play, I think, the past 3 weeks. Ever since he came back from injury, he's hit or exceeded his value. So I like Christian McCaffrey here versus the Miami Dolphins. Okay, another stud on the slate is Najee Harris from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Najee Harris has averaged 20.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 18.8 rush attempts per game and 6.2 pass targets per game. So just a ton of volume, and he's on the field for 85% of the snaps, going to be about 7% owned, projected at 19.2 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 8,200 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Steelers trailing by 4. So Najee Harris has scored 17, 20, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 12, 26, and 22 rush attempts on top of 6, 4, and 3 pass targets. So he does normally get 20 plus touches. I expect that to be the case this week. So I like Najee Harris here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, now if you want to save some salary on this slate, this guy is no longer on the injury list, so it means he's going to be good to go this week. So I like James Robinson from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 6th worst defense overall. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Robinson has averaged 15.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.4 rush attempts per game and 3.6 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 14% owned, projected at 16.1 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 6,200 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the Jaguars trailing by 1.5. So fantastic matchup here for James Robinson. He scored 12 and 18 fantasy points the last 2 weeks off of 12 and 12 rush attempts and 3 and 5 pass targets. And he's been a little banged up, but he's full strength now. He should get 15 to 20 touches in this game. I think he's going to run all over the Atlanta Falcons. And he's got a nice price tag where you can save some salary with this pick with 20 plus fantasy point upside. So I like James Robinson here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, 2 more running backs that you can save some salary with. Actually, we'll go with 3. The first guy that I like is Melvin Gordon from the Denver Broncos playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Melvin Gordon has averaged 13.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.8 rush attempts per game and 2.8 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 5% owned, projected at 12.3 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 5,300 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Broncos trailing by 2.5. So Melvin Gordon, he hasn't been exceptional this year. Boo! So Melvin Gordon has scored 10, 18, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 9, 21, and 10 rush attempts on top of 4, 3, and 3 pass targets. So pretty decent volume the past 3 games. But the reason I like this pick is because low salary, low ownership, and a fantastic matchup. The Chargers have not been able to stop the running back position. So I like Melvin Gordon here versus the LA Chargers. Okay, now just 2 quick picks. I'm not going to go through everything with these guys. But if you want to save some salary and get some low ownership, you want to take a risk or a gamble at a deep sleeper pick here, take a look at Jeff Wilson Jr. from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. And Jeff Wilson Jr., I think he's going to get the opportunity to be the lead back here, the starting running back, because of the injuries at this position. So he got 19 rush attempts and 2 pass targets last week. Now, he only scored 7 fantasy points, but he's going to be about 3% owned, projected at 9.7 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $5,300 DraftKings salary, $500 more on FanDuel. And the 49ers have had a pretty decent running game despite all the injuries. So if Jeff Wilson Jr. is going to come in this week, start the game, and get 20 plus touches, I like his chances here in a good matchup at low ownership and a low price tag. So I like Jeff Wilson Jr. here versus the Minnesota Vikings.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
And the last kind of dart throw pick, even though his ownership is actually not too low, it's 9%, but I like Miles Sanders from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the New York Giants, who have the 8th worst defense overall. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Now, Miles Sanders has not played well this season, only averaging 8.9 fantasy points per game, getting an average of 9.9 rush attempts per game and 3.1 pass targets per game. But he's been on the field for 81% of the snaps while he's been healthy and out there. And he's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 13.2 fantasy points here in week 12. He's $5,100 DraftKings salary, $1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Eagles favored by 3.5. So I think you could make a case for Miles Sanders this week because he got 16 rush attempts and 1 pass target last week. Now, only scored 8 fantasy points, but this guy is just due to have a breakout game, and he's got a great matchup here versus the Giants. So I think he's worth considering, as I'd call him a sleeper pick, even though his ownership is 9%. I think it's a high risk, high reward play here. So I like Miles Sanders here versus the New York Giants. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I like Deebo Samuel from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Deebo Samuel has averaged 22.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.8 pass targets per game and 1.9 rush attempts per game. So Deebo Samuel last game got 8 rush attempts, only 2 pass targets, and the game before that he got 5 rush attempts and 5 pass targets. So it's interesting that they are using Deebo Samuel in the running game. He's on the field for 83% of the snaps, going to be about 16% owned, projected at 18.1 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 7,900 DraftKings salary, 100 more on FanDuel. And the other reason that I like this pick is because if you take a look at our wide receiver cornerback matchups cheat sheet here, it's linked from the news. When you log into Draft Dashboard, there's a link that goes right to this. And Deebo Samuel has a fantastic cornerback matchup versus Bashaud Breeland, who's giving up 0.41 fantasy points per route. So you add the fact that he's got a great cornerback matchup and he's getting all these rush attempts, he could have a monster week here in a fantastic matchup. So I like Deebo Samuel here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, another wide receiver that I like is DJ Moore from the Carolina Panthers playing the Miami Dolphins, who have the third worst defense overall. They give up the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DJ Moore has averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.3 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 85% of the snaps, going to be about 12% owned, projected at 14.5 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 6,200 DraftKings salary, 500 more on FanDuel, and DJ Moore has scored 16, 6, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 7, 7, and 7 pass targets. So even with Christian McCaffrey back, he's getting plenty of passing volume, and his salary's come down. So only 6,200 DraftKings salary and 500 more on FanDuel. I like that price on both sites. I think he's got some pretty big upside here in a good matchup. So I like DJ Moore here versus the Miami Dolphins. Now I also like Brandon Cooks from the Houston Texans playing the New York Jets, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Brandon Cooks has averaged 14.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.7 pass targets per game. And he's been on the field for 89% of the snaps, going to be about 15% owned, projected at 14 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 5,800 DraftKings salary, 700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Houston Texans favored by 2.5. So great matchup here. Brandon Cooks has been getting a lot of volume, although only 3 pass targets last week. He scored 4, 12, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks, off of 3, 13, and 6 pass targets. So I do expect the volume to come back up to a right around his season average here this week. So I like Brandon Cooks here versus the New York Jets. Okay, so I also like Michael Pittman Jr. I like Brandon Ayuk. I like Jamison Crowder, Laviska Shenault, and Jalen Waddle. So those are the wide receivers that I'm going to target this week. Now let's take a look at the tight end position. So I like George Kittle. I think he's a great stud pick here this week. He doesn't have the best tight end matchup, but the Minnesota Vikings defense, they're the 5th worst defense overall. George Kittle has averaged 13.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 pass targets per game. On the field for 100% of the snaps, going to be about 10% owned, projected at 14.9 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 6,400 DraftKings salary, 300 more on FanDuel. I think he makes a pretty interesting stack with Jimmy Garoppolo, save some salary on Jimmy, and stack him with George Kittle, who's got some pretty big upside here. He scored 13, 16, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks, off of 4, 7, and 8 pass targets.
So I like George Kittle here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Now, another stud on the slate, and I've been picking this guy every week. I just think he's one of the top talents at the position, just kind of stuck on a bad team, but he is just waiting to break out any given game, and I think that game could be this week. So I like Kyle Pitts from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Kyle Pitts has averaged 11.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.9 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 74% of the snaps, going to be about 9% owned, projected at 14.1 fantasy points here in week 12. He's 6,100 DraftKings salary, 500 more on FanDuel. Now, he only scored 6, 10, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 7, and 7 pass targets, but he does have a 30-plus fantasy point ceiling. I think he's in a good spot here this week. If the Jaguars should be able to keep this game competitive and keep the pressure on the Atlanta Falcons to score the ball. It could be the Kyle Pitts show. So I like Kyle Pitts here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, now I also like Dallas Goedert, but the guy that I like even a little bit more than that because of the low ownership. So Dallas Goedert's going to be about 13% owned. I think he's a great play. He's 4,800 DraftKings salary, 1,100 more on FanDuel. But the tight end that I'm going to target here in my tournaments is Noah Fant. Noah Fant from the Denver Broncos playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Noah Fant has averaged 10.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.6 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 83% of the snaps, only going to be about 4% owned, projected at 10.2 fantasy points here in week 12, and he's 4,600 DraftKings salary, 1,300 more on FanDuel. So Noah Fant scored 11 fantasy points last week off of 6 pass targets. So I like Noah Fant here versus the LA Chargers.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.